And as we talk about trying to get prepared and ready for what's already hitting us, you see, people now realize the New World Order, globalism is real. And about 2% of the population is now trying to prep. Most experts I talk to say that if 3 to 4 to 5% start to prep, that's going to drive up prices on everything and is going to put prepping and preparation out of reach of a lot of people. So it's important now to start moving in that direction. And hopefully we can reverse the tide of tyranny and this won't be needed.
Most people, and I can't blame them, we're victims of the world that we live in, but we live in a world of illusions. Now, those illusions of prosperity have somewhat broken since 2008. But in fact, people still think that things are pretty good. Restaurants are full, the movie houses are full, people are still spending money. We have kind of a segmented, selective recession, selective depression. People have to understand that there's systematic evil in the world. This isn't just one bad guy looking after his personal interests. This is systematic evil that thinks in strategic ways. We have to learn to think strategically.
It's a three-level chess, and it's a stratagem, a deceptive stratagem.
That's right. And the stratagem is we're going to antagonize the world. It hands Russia and China the excuse to say, we went to war with the West so that we could stop the bully of the world, and the world will applaud. Well, all of these strategic antagonisms around the world is meant to set the United States, set the West up, and that's why NATO's involved in this, so that Western Europe is as guilty in the eyes of the world as the West, as the antagonists, the bullies of the world. Ron Paul is absolutely right. They hate us not because of our freedoms, they hate us because we're in those countries, occupying those countries, and worse, our CIA is undermining leaders, changing leadership, getting dirt on leaders so that they can manipulate world leaders to follow the globalist agenda. And all of this is going to eventually end up very bad for the United States. We're going to have a nuclear preemptive strike against this country. The leaders want it, they're preparing for it, they're covering for it. They aren't telling the American people that Russia is building a tremendous nuclear arsenal, even as we continue to disarm, even as they do not disarm, even while we disarm, and we don't tell the American people that we know that they're not disarming. I mean, this is a tremendous charade, an evil charade.
I see the underground bases. I see the giving away of the Panama Canal. I see the destroying of infrastructure while building an underground infrastructure, and not just physically underground, but a shadow government system. There's instant, evidence everywhere that the elite is, building up towards the type of thing you're talking about.
There is evidence. For example, when I was designing and helping to build and oversee high-security homes around the nation, I would find contractors who would say that he's former CIA, he's former Treasury, and they're all building bunkers under the house. So they know that something big is coming. They're not building those bunkers, and the U.S. isn't building huge underground bases and bunkers because of some terrorist threat. They know that a massive nuclear attack is coming. They want that attack to come. The most important thing is for people to start to think strategically, meaning stop looking at the news alone. You've got to get alternative sources of information. You've got to understand that there's a different underlying agenda. We are not in Iraq because of democracy. We're not in Afghanistan. It's never going to have democracy. It's there for antagonism, for capture of resources, for changing the balance of power in the Middle East, a lot of things that are not good for America. What this means is eventually, when these illusions are stripped away, when this war finally rebels against the United States, in one day, America will go from day to night. And if you haven't prepared in advance, there's not enough time to prepare in 24 hours, even if you saw it that early. Now, it's important not only to not be on the last train out of town. Most people won't even be ready and won't be able to get out of town when any of these nuclear weapons fall, because there'll be absolute panic. There's going to be instant social unrest because nobody is prepared. FEMA can't even hope to handle a national crisis of this emergency any more than they could handle Katrina. Don't even think about getting on the freeways. They'll be instantly clogged. You have to have either got out of town sooner or be prepared. Now, you don't want to be part of a major metropolitan area when that happens. And so this is the crux of what I teach people in strategic relocation. How, because people mostly have to stay within population centers to earn a living, but how to prepare contingency planning so that you can get out into retreat areas and have the information, the forewarning signs to know how to do that. And that's really the only way to survive. Most people cannot get rural right now. They can't make a living. It's just impossible. So this is a solution for everyone. But let's talk about this major threat. The number one that I concentrate on is not terrorism. It's not natural disaster. It's not even government or war. The major threat is population density, because every crisis that threatens, even a local crisis, can turn exponential because of close proximity to other people who cannot help themselves. Even good people panic in a crisis. You don't have to be evil. It doesn't have to be just a Watts. When you have no food after 3 days, all of the store shelves are empty. If there's no water, it's exacerbated. If there's no electricity, there's going to be no gasoline. People are limited. You won't even be able to walk out of town because of the danger of threat from people interacting with other people. So population density is the major threat.
Once the public figures out they need to get out of Dodge, it's too late.
We also have the example of World War II. World War II in Germany, we have the example of the Russians coming in, and every German city was being emptied out to get away from the Russians. They did not want to be occupied. Literally, entire cities were emptying out, taking to the roads. And so we know how far they go far afield of the roads trying to get food and water and hitting the farmhouses. And basically, it was within about 5 to 7 miles apart from every road where those farms would all be looted. And so you have to take those kinds of things into consideration when you're considering, yes, going rural, what may look rural. That's what I call strategic thinking. Can't just think about how nice and idyllic it is in rural Austin, out in the suburbs. You've got to look, how far am I away from a major county road that goes out there and that's going to be streaming with refugees. There's going to be famine. They're going to be out of water, out of gas. They're going to start spanning out within walking distance. And that, for most people that are tired and hungry and modern day people, is about 5 miles. You've got to be beyond that. We know from Katrina, for example, a couple of lessons. Don't get on the freeways once because they'll be trapped. You get on a freeway, it's like in an elevated moat. It's got barriers on either side. If your car goes out, if you're stuck in traffic, there's no way to go except abandon your vehicle and get off on foot. But one other thing you learn in Katrina is you don't go into the arms of the federal government. Don't go into a FEMA camp, because a FEMA refugee center becomes a concentration camp. You can't get out. They didn't let people out of the Superdome, even when it became horrible conditions. And people said, I'm better off on the outside. Could not get out.
They wouldn't let them walk out on the highways.
That's right. Let's talk now about picking a safe country before we get to the analysis of North America. I get a lot of calls, Alex, about people wanting to leave the country. The basic philosophy, their line of reasoning is, this is where the globalist leaders are. This is where the bad guys are. They intend to do many bad things to us. They're getting ready to lock people up. They're building concentration camps. I got to get out of the country. And so let's talk about a little about international retreating and what are the various options and opinions and problems. One of the problems is that all of the international websites about retreating to foreign countries are run by expatriates. Expatriates are people with money who have left the country, living the high life in Costa Rica or Australia and New Zealand. And it's a very deceptive point of view because things aren't going to be like that in a crisis. You have to look strategically, think strategically about what's going to happen to these nations when a real crisis, and are they going to be reacting the same to Americans in their presence as now? So let's look at this map and talk about some of the regions of the world. This is a world population density map, and you notice how high the population density is here in the Far East, in the Southern Belt, in India, China, Indonesia, all of these countries. Extreme high population densities. This is not where you want to be. It's a very bad place. Europe is also a crown jewel of beauty in the nation, but it's extremely high density. I had a call from Czechoslovakia asking for advice about how do I implement strategic relocation, or have you done advice about Europe? And I said, no, it's really a lost cause. Too high density of population to survive there well in a crisis. You can also see in the Americas how you have the high population density in the east. Mexico is very, very high density. So is Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama. This is the band here from Venezuela to Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. The bright spot in these nations is Chile and Uruguay. Now, Uruguay looks like it has a higher population density, but in fact, most of that is averaged out. It's only along the coast. Very low population density here. These two countries are fairly free market and amenable to people. These nations, Costa Rica especially, has a great deal of affinity towards American expatriates there, but prices are rising because there are so many Americans there. What people don't realize is that in Latin America, almost all of the educated intelligentsia, bureaucrats in government, are Marxists, and they hate Americans, especially after George Bush. So it's very difficult to count on these areas accepting Americans, not taking advantage of Americans. Argentina, Mexico, and a couple of other countries, Brazil and others, have confiscated American bank accounts historically in the past. Now let's take a look at the map of economic freedom in the world. It's very telling about power economically and governmental vis-a-vis liberty. This is a very, very telling map because even though population density showed that these are not heavily populated and they're not very livable like in the jungles of Brazil, look at the economic freedom. These are terrible countries. Actually, China is only temporarily allowing some economic freedom, but it should be darker than this. I didn't create all of this or make the ratings. But look at Mexico, very, very highly regulatory. Costa Rica is a little bit better. Panama is a little better. Venezuela is very bad. Colombia is bad. Peru is bad, or Ecuador is bad. Peru, less bad. And Chile is almost white. Chile's the best nation of Latin America if you're going to migrate. Uruguay is next, small country, not as corrupt as Argentina. In fact, they play off the fact that Argentina is very restrictive about many things, including controlling wealth, and so they get the overflow of people leaving Argentina. Most of the high-density population international crowd lives on the coast. Prices are very expensive. They're in dollars. But here in the interior of the country, I've lived there for a couple of years. That's a real gem. Cheap property, wonderful people, a totally different country than the high-priced coast. There's nothing in Africa that I recommend. This is an anomaly in terms of economic freedom. It's actually just anarchy, and I don't consider that a very good bet for economic freedom. Europe, as you can see, has some economic freedom. This matches my highest recommendation in Europe is Spain in terms of a livable country. A lot of expat communities, Brits especially, that have located down on the Mediterranean side of Spain. But Spain has a good, friendly people, wide-ranging agriculture, and if you'll notice, like in the movie The Great Escape, when everyone wanted to leave Europe in a problem, they went through Spain. So Spain's my top pick in Europe. Australia has a fair amount of economic freedom, but once again, the problem with Australia and New Zealand, twofold: very difficult to get in and get residency, make you pay a lot of money. The Australians have sold out to the Chinese interests. Almost all of their national resources have been bought or have contracted to China.
I was reading, National Geographic was bragging that 98% or something of all their mines and rare earth minerals are Chinese run, as if that was a good thing to have Australia now a satellite economically of the Chicoms.
But I can guarantee you that China will occupy Australia during the next war to make sure that they secure those things. And so if you want to live under Chinese occupation, it may be very similar to Japanese occupation. The Orientals are pretty ruthless, have very little regard for human life as a philosophy. Historically speaking, they have been the worst abusers of human rights in general against whole populations during wartime. So it doesn't speak well of retreating to these two countries. I think they'll also take New Zealand just because it's too close to Australia. Canada is my second best bet after the United States. The reason I'm still bullish on the United States as a retreat international location is because it's got the highest per capita density of liberty-oriented, freedom-educated people in the entire world. The problem in living in Latin America is that they're friendly to Americans now generally, but if ever the government clamps down and the globalists who control this country and Canada put out the word to control American expats or send them home, you're going to find that those countries will comply. They are yes men to the globalist establishment. Canada, only advantage toward the United States is millions of square miles of wide open spaces to the north, though the climate is more hostile. The only acceptable strategy I find is living in border areas where you can go back and forth depending on what you need. That's fairly easy to do between Canada and the United States. I exclude the eastern portion of Canada because all of the cities, about 90% of Canadians live within 50 miles of the American border, and thus they become extensions of the American cities.
How does Alaska tie in, or Hawaii? Obviously, Hawaii is not a place to be.
Hawaii, I give a 0 rating, the lowest rating possible because it is an island, because it's far away from the mainland, and I believe it's possible if there is occupation in the United States during war, it's going to be Hawaii that gets occupied. It's a strategic outpost for military adventurism, and the Chinese would be foolish not to take it. So it's a possibility that China could occupy Hawaii. But in any case, even if it gets cut off, I've lived in Hawaii. I know that it depends on shipping every week to bring in food, gasoline. You're going to be out of those things. Even though Kauai is my choice of an island if you have to live in Hawaii because it can be self-sufficient, Oahu is not self-sufficient agriculturally. The Big Island is self-sufficient. And so Kauai or Hawaii are the best places to be. But I'm afraid, as in any island, that it could be surrounded and occupied and you just simply can't get off the island if you need to. Now, Alaska is a very interesting case. I downgrade Alaska even though you could be self-sufficient there in the southern panhandle up through Anchorage, but it's still a very hostile environment. It's like an island. Everything has to be shipped into Alaska, and it's very, very difficult to leave if it should become untenable to live there. This is not easy to get down through the Alcan Highway.
So it doesn't have lines of retreat?
It doesn't have lines of retreat. So the only place I recommend, or the only way I recommend for Alaskans, is those that are very, very skilled survivalists who can live in the boondocks throughout the winter, apart from society. If you're capable of doing that, then
Let me throw some wild cards at you. What about Iceland? What about Greenland? What about islands that are out in the middle of nowhere, just as bad as Hawaii?
Actually, Greenland is worse. There's only a few pockets of civilization on Greenland that survive even in the best of times. And they, once again, depend on absolute shipping for everything. They don't grow anything there. Iceland depends on everything being shipped in as well. Iceland has recovered from its globalist banking nightmare simply by stiffing the globalists. But if you look 10 years from now, you'll find that they'll be penalized and cut off. They, by reneging on their debt, have got a fairly self-sufficient economy right now. But because it is a socialist economy, they'll be back in the piggy bank, negative piggy bank state, probably within a decade. So I don't recommend Iceland as well. It's just, everything is extremely socialistic in Europe, and they're starting to have a backlash right now against the globalists like Sarkozy in France. He's going to lose this next election.
So to be clear, from my analysis, the only people that would want to flee the United States is if you're a big fish politically like myself, yourself, Ron Paul or somebody. If it's going to full Soviet-style globalist roundup, taking us to a camp, if we could foresee that happening, we would try to get out of the country or maybe go to a rural retreat, but they might come after us there. But for everybody else, if you really look at it, the United States has the most people that are awake. It's where the fortunes of the planet will rise or fall. And my instinct, my gut, my discernment is stay in the United States and fight it out here. And by fight it out, I mean occupy the land, be here, educate people, and dig in and hope for the best, but also prepare for the worst.
I really agree with that analysis, Alex. If you're going to live, high-profile people, I speak multiple languages. I've done that on purpose so that I can go to other countries. One of the reasons why I prefer Uruguay is because there's a lot of Europeans there. I can blend in there. I can't blend in Peru or Colombia. Just don't blend in very well when you're pure Caucasian. But it's very important to get native language speed if you're going to try to blend into those countries, because someday, you know, there will be a roundup of Americans. There will be confiscation of properties. There's a lot of Americans here in little enclaves in Mexico.
Jesse Ventura.
Yeah, and I think that's a dead place for Americans. I'll tell you, the crime is very, very bad. The corruption, you can't depend on any kind of safety there. Staying in the American enclaves, they'll eventually be raided. And
so you think the Baja is a death trap?
Yeah, I think it's a death trap. So don't judge these countries because you have American enclaves that are living the high life right now. I can guarantee you that will not survive.
Well, they're going to be ripe for the picking.
Yeah, ripe for the picking. And when Mexicans are out of things, and if the druggies don't get you, you know, the criminal elements within.
Well, in Mexico, they're already killing all the middle-class people and are kidnapping them right now.
And that will get only worse. Kidnapping was the bane of Central America. El Salvador, Guatemala went through a lot of kidnapping. I was down there in the 80s when that was occurring, stayed at a house with bloodstains still on the wall from the owner being kidnapped, ransom, paid the ransom, he was killed anyway. Believe me, this is kidnapping haven, and it will happen. I want to go to a general map of the United States to show some strategic value of areas in the east and the west and why Utah and Idaho end up being so highly rated. As we remember, we talked about population densities are extremely high in this eastern area. And in fact, it extends completely over to about halfway through the states of, in the middle of the country. A lot of people out here in the farmland as well. Because of that high population density, none of these states rate anything above 3 in the East Coast. Tennessee is the highest rated state because it's got the Cumberland Plateau. There's this big Appalachian mountain chain here, which kind of is a blocking area for the major population center here. The Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee is a high 1,000-foot plateau. People will tend to infiltrate through the mountains, over the mountains, through the valleys. And when they get into the Tennessee valleys, they're very tempting to stay in the valleys. Nobody wants to climb up a 1,000-foot plateau where there's not a lot of people. That's one of the reasons why this is very good. For the Northeast, they need, there's this Northeast region of the wooded areas of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and upstate New York. Those are the only safe areas. The problem strategically is that once you retreat up there, you're stuck. If it becomes untenable, you can't get back west because these population flows will flow this way and cut off any retreat unless you go up through Canada, if one wants to try to get further west if this becomes untenable. The major refugee flows coming out of the East Coast will be in this population area here. They'll head out through Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Some will go north along that. Some will go south this way, trying to avoid the mountains. And that's why we give a lower rating to the southeast states, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. They'll also have all of the refugees flowing out of Florida. This is a 0-rated state as well because it's untenable for survival of this amount of population, and most people will tend to flee south and then west towards Louisiana and Texas.
So that's going to make Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama a disaster zone.
Right. The only good areas that I recommend in these southeastern areas are the northern hill country and mountainous areas. The Ozarks of Arkansas are a good area, southern Missouri. That's the primary destination.
Yeah, a lot of
Midwest.
elites are building bunkers in that area.
That's right, they are. The great advantage that the West has, the far West, now these are your troubled areas here where your population densities are, but centering around Salt Lake City, for example, even though this is not a recommended area itself, and you can see there's a military target in Hill Air Force Base as well as the new NSA computer center, data center there, which makes another additional target. The greatness of the Intermountain West is that you're surrounded by 500 miles of mountains or deserts that keep people from Denver Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Seattle from getting across those deserts without gasoline, electricity, and other infrastructure. You're not going to walk across those things, I can guarantee you.
It has a huge filter.
It's a huge filter, and that's why this is the safest zone here in the West.
What's the sweet spots? Where do you live?
All right. I live in Utah here, and south of this zone here, which I consider the southern and central part of Utah safer than the north because you're cut off from this area here.
How is the gorgeous areas around Monument Valley down here in the south?
Yes, these are all the red rock country of Utah, and the beauty of red rock country is that they're desert, there's very few people. You can survive. The mountains provide the reservoirs of water. There are rivers coming out of all of those mountains, and if you can get water, even though it cannot sustain a great deal of population in these areas, you want that to be a filter. You want people to think, I'm not going to Utah because there's no water. Well, there is water for those that are already there. And there are high altitude mountains for retreat cabins, which become very inaccessible, in excess of 7,000 to 10,000 feet, where you can get up where very few people can hike and get to. And they're forested here. Now, Colorado has some of the same terrain, but the problem is Denver is a major New World Order center. There's a major concentration camp being prepared in Denver. There are secret bunker systems under the Denver airport. There are black helicopter bases out of Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado.
And just a few miles down the road is Colorado Springs.
And there's Colorado Springs, Cheyenne Mountain. I don't know why the powers that be moved NORAD out of Cheyenne Mountain into Peterson Air Force Base. It makes the city an obliterated target. And I have recommended everyone in Colorado Springs who hears my voice needs to be relocated so they're not there, because the powers that be have made a major Air Force base within the city as a target. Omaha, Nebraska, of course, is Offutt Air Force Base. That's the alternate Cheyenne Mountain here, and that's where all of the powers that be went during the 9/11. That's where the president went. That's where Warren Buffett had all of the CEOs, top CEOs from the World Trade Center at Offutt Air Force Base. You can't tell me that they didn't know what was coming on. Now, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming are, to a certain extent, in many regards, better than Utah.
I got to stop you. How weird is that? It was in the news that they had hundreds of these top people. Before it even happened, they were all there for a special announcement. What was said in that hangar? What was done? I mean, did they say, look, you've seen what's happened, get in line? I mean, that talk about bizarre.
It is. Unfortunately, nobody's talked. We don't know. They won't give a list of who was there, although we do know that some of the CEOs that survived were at Offutt Air Force Base.
Yeah, who would have been in the World Trade Centers that day?
That's right, who would have been in the World Trade. They had advance notice. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who left knew what was happening to the World Center, but certainly Buffett knew. Certainly, he's shown himself to be an insider player.
And that's the excuse to get him out. And plus, they're acting secretive about it. That shows you something was going on.
That's right. So there are some advantages to being to the north in more hostile climate in terms of, and this is the area right here, which Jim Rawls of the Survival Blog has his redoubt, which he feels is the safest area, but that's from a military standoff point of view. I don't subscribe necessarily to that for most people. Very few people are capable of engaging in a military standoff. I also give high credence to areas that have a high population base of people of the Mormon faith, because they're preparedness oriented. They have a lot of food storage, a lot more than the population in general.
Shifting gears, I noticed Montana and North Dakota has incredible nuke strike points.
That's right. These are where your missile fields are still remaining in the United States, and that's why I give a very poor rating to anything in this area here. But there's a mountain range separating this safe area here, and that is not a missile strike area. That's a Bureau of Land Management area here. But this is where Pastor Chuck Baldwin went with his people, Whitefish, Montana, Kalispell, Montana. It's a very good area. The problem with these areas, they are very safe. They are a long distance away from, how should I say, civilization. So you got to take 2 hops to get to a major port like Seattle or other place where you can fly out. So if you're running a business, if you have to travel, that's why for most people, this area around Salt Lake City, even though I don't recommend the city itself, this area is much more user-friendly in terms of
moving quickly, tell me about the Midwest. Tell me about Austin, where we're at. Tell me about...
All right, so Texas, and what I really need to do is shift to a different map here. These are the safe areas outlined in yellow here. And let's talk about Texas a little bit. We have accentuated, this has been enhanced graphically to show population in red. Every one of these dots are thousands of people. And what we've shown here is like an arterial system. This is where your danger zones are, where large population centers are. San Antonio is a large one. Dallas-Fort Worth is the largest. Houston is a large one here. And you have to realize that those population centers, when these cities die through cutoff of supplies and infrastructure, are going to get out in the hinterland. Most people are going to try to follow roads to get to a place where they have relatives, where they know other people. They're not going to make it. The freeways are going to be crowded. They're going to run out of gasoline. They're going to run out of food. And then they're going to start to go north and south of those freeways. And that's why these areas here are away from those patterns. This in the southeast Texas area, the pine forest, this is beautiful country around Palestine, Texas, etc.
Yeah, we've got a ranch right there.
Yeah. There's a lot of beautiful land here, but there's a lot of little towns there. In other words,
well, when hurricanes hit, they had one a few years ago, crime exploded as everybody got flushed out of Houston, and literally the millions of illegals, that was one of the big problems. It just poured up into these areas. But a bunch of people got shot when they were trying to rob and stuff, but it was a crime wave up here as everybody got driven out of Houston when it flooded.
So these are what I would call macro recommendations, meaning these are general areas where you want to find specific. It doesn't mean that everything is as safe as everything else here. I give specific recommendations in the book of how to find specific safe properties.
It's just if you're going to be in Texas, here are safer areas.
That's right.
Here are bug out routes.
Right. These are the areas, and these are the dangerous areas that you don't want to be anywhere near close. Remember, you can look at these as pockets of high density people that when things are cut off, they suddenly triple their size, and everything around that becomes compromised as they expand out to look for food. So even though you may right now have a real nice piece of property outside of Austin, if you're 20 minutes away, the chances are it's going to get overwhelmed at some point. So you need a leapfrog strategy for minor, moderate catastrophes. You can survive 20 minutes out, but then you need a cabin out there in the hill country further on that's out there so far that nobody's going to walk to it. That's the basic strategy. And as you see in this of the Midwest here, you see these huge areas, Detroit and Chicago and Columbus and Cincinnati. And even though there's a lot of rural, and you drive through those areas and you think, gee, this is still very rural, you've got to look at these depictions that we've made of how dense these populations are. And when they spread out, all of these areas around those are going to be compromised. And so you have to be pretty far away to even have any chance of surviving. And you're much better off when you start getting further west, where it gets...
And just watch what the elites do. It's on the news. They're building bunkers and castles and armored redoubts in the Ozarks.
That's right.
I mean, it's amazing. And I know you've built some of these homes or advised on them.
That's right. So let's go to Idaho then, if you want to bring up the map of Idaho, and we'll talk about a safe state and some specific areas in this. Now, Idaho has Boise here, which is the only economically viable area for people who have high-income jobs, technical jobs. Boise's kind of a new technical center. This is a beautiful farming valley along the Snake River. Good areas on either side of this. This is all irrigated farmland. This is a little better out here in terms of being away from the main freeways. Very few people come up this way. But this is a beautiful retreat area here, lots of farmlands here. This is Jackson Hole over here, which is not a good area. But this is a beautiful mountained, forested area here, where lots of high mountain cabins, and yet you can grow crops down here in this area. This, however, this shows how I point out in the book, climate plays a role. This is the Rocky Chain coming down here, and then it goes down into Utah. Your cold mountain air from Canada comes sweeping down in here, and you get some very severe cold winters. These areas are almost 15 degrees warmer in the winter than these areas because these mountains keep this cold air from coming back into this area. This is a banana belt here in Idaho around Lewiston. One of the top retreat areas here is along the Nez Perce River. This is where Kuskia is. This is the Nez Perce Indian Reservation, which I don't recommend you get on because of the sensitivity of minorities taking back their land, even if they contract with you. But here you get Columbia River, moist northwest air. You get trees growing down at the 2,500 foot level, conifer trees, whereas here in the high mountain and in Utah, you don't get conifers up till 6,000 feet. It takes snow to melt to grow conifers. But here you get enough rain from the northwest coming over that you have a microcosm. This is like northwest climate, clear up here into the panhandle of Idaho. A lot of beautiful areas here, Boundary County, around Sandpoint, Idaho, no building codes up in Boundary County. This is where Hayden Lake is, where the Aryan Nation was. They have been rooted out. This was a government operation of playing like they were neo-Nazis. They had hired Pastor Butler to run that organization, but they're cleared out now and gone. So this is healing. I don't normally ever recommend people get around a government-operated survivalist or phony survivalist community because it gives the whole...
And they're looking to set people up.
And they're looking to set people up. So you don't want to join survivalist groups that are very public, militia groups. You want to be supportive, but if you join, all of those organizations get infiltrated. Very dangerous to be a part of it. So I recommend informal networks of people. So let's go to the East Coast now, Alex, and explain one of the more difficult states to get out of and live in. We're going to talk about New Jersey. New Jersey is a zero-rated state, like Florida and Hawaii. It's just got a tremendous amount of difficulties to overcome. It isn't to say there aren't some nice rural farm areas in New Jersey, but New Jersey has the problem that it's backed up by all of this population center, Staten Island, Manhattan, and everybody's going out through Jersey even to get up towards New York. So this is one of the most difficult things to consider as well when you consider you've got Philadelphia right here, so that you're sandwiched, and even people trying to go this way is going to run smack into the social unrest of Philadelphia. Going down south in terms of retreats is a problem because you've got this Delaware River coming up here. You're cut off except for a few bridges. There's nothing worse than trying to retreat and having millions of people come down there and get stuck at a bridge where nobody can get across. So I have taken time in the book to give a very specific example of how you plan if you have to live in New York and you're living in a suburb of Newark, for example, of how to get out of this area and how carefully you have to plan. I'm going to switch to this larger map now to indicate how to do this. This is Newark, Manhattan here, Staten Island. In our example, we've got a family living in Livingston. This is in a suburb, and there are miles and miles and waves of suburbs. They don't start to really get rural until you get out about this far. This is a close-up of where we live in Livingston here, and it shows the problem. We've got freeways here and here, and a lot of people don't realize that these freeways are trap zones. You cannot cross the freeways unless you find an entrance or an off-ramp or an exit. And I believe that in a crisis, not only will the freeways be packed full of people, that all of the on-ramps and the off-ramps will be packed with people too, and you won't be able to cross the freeway, even if you don't want to get on the freeway. But in every freeway, there are a few places. One is right here. This road goes under the freeway, and there is no off-ramp or any on-ramp. So you can scoot on by that freeway and get going further on. This is another alternate route that I've planned out here. These are all rural roads, non-major or secondary roads that also go under the freeway here. It's very, very important. You've got river obstacles here. You've got to watch for bridges. You've got to plan various bridge routes to make sure that you can get across there. So now going back into the larger map, we're trying to avoid Picatinny Arsenal, which is a secondary nuclear target here. We want to stay away, give them a wide berth. The freeway goes much, much too close to that area. if you ever do, by the way, get on a freeway, you want to make sure that you get on past any major cities so that there isn't anything to block your way. If you take 80, which is the better freeway in getting out, it takes you up towards northern Pennsylvania. It's the clearest route out of the east to take Interstate 80. 78 takes you right into Philadelphia, not a good freeway to get on. You're going to have to get off before that. And you have to get around these areas, mostly through secondary roads if you're going to bypass Philadelphia. If this is clear, if you get on after Susquehanna, your chances of getting all the way to near Buffalo are pretty good on that freeway. But for our example here, we're going to take and do a retreat in a rural town called Newton here. And the alternate routes are the ones in gray. This is the main route that we've chosen. Tried to avoid bridges, but you can't with this many rivers here. Once on a rural road, we want to avoid going through the town of Susquehanna. So this is our primary route, even though it goes longer and further away to get to Newton. This is the preferred route. You really want secondary roads, not freeways, that go through a few towns, and it's very difficult to find because secondary roads do go through towns.
So basically, wherever you live, you should at least think about evacuation routes that aren't on the main road. I mean, when it's Friday night, you can't get home because of the traffic. Whenever there's a hurricane, it creates traffic all over the state because everybody drives up. People die on the highway. They get stuck for days. They run out of gas. I mean, if you get a real collapse or a war or an attack, it would just be bedlam.
That's right. One of the interesting things to practice is during maximum traffic hour, when even the secondary roads in a town going to places are pretty full of traffic, try to map out a route where you only go on the residential streets and time yourself, and you'll find generally you'll get through faster by sticking just to the residential. And that simulates.
I already do that.
That simulates what you would do, is actually go down residential roads that just have houses on either side that are not a secondary road. But this is the key. The key is finding, and you have to do this with Google Maps. If you get to Google Earth or satellite view, you can zoom in close enough that you can see, if you follow this freeway with your mouse, you can find areas that don't have an on-ramp or an off-ramp. And that's the secret for getting through.
But bottom line, if you can, don't live in New York or New Jersey. Don't live in Hawaii. Don't live in Florida. And if you're going to have to live in one of these other states, live near enough to one of these safer pockets.
That's right. And what I tell people is that you do have time